On Monday, I wandered around Barons Court and West Kensington without much gusto, really, looking for the handwritten ads in shop windows so I could find a cheap place to live. But the truth was, it all looked really too nice an area for me to be allowed into, and I didn't even bother with Earl's Court because that's quite a nice area and it's too close to the middle of town. So I thought, that won't happen, it won't work. And as I was walking around, I remembered actually that 20 years earlier, I used to work in West Kensington. There was a little Victorian industrial estate where I'd worked for a mail order firm, engraving limited edition crystal bells. I was quite happy. They just gave me a little cubbyhole all day. And when I left, they said, "You've been great. Come back anytime." I suddenly thought, maybe I can come back. And I wandered around and I found the industrial estate. It's been converted to luxury apartments. And the big, beautiful wrought iron gates were still there, but they were electronically locked. The next day, I thought I'd do northwest London, and I vaulted over Harlesden, Willesden, Neasden, most of Acton, thinking I didn't really want to live in those places. Location, location, location. But Hampstead was too glamorous an area to allow me into, so that left me as a compromise with a little strip of West Hampstead. And there, I actually did finally get in to see one of the properties I've been inquiring about. It was a little tiny room, and the mattress, single mattress, smelled of marijuana, and my possible housemates were all kind of huddled in the doorway peering at me. Really, I thought as if they imagined I was somebody's dad come to do an intervention. I knew that wasn't going to work. Phoned another landlord and he said, "I'll meet you outside Finchley Road and Frognall Station at 2:30, and I was absolutely 100% certain that he wouldn't. Nevertheless, I was there at 2:15, the cold, fine rain splashing off my cheeks, and I was still there at 3 o'clock and there'd been no sign. I thought he might have driven past me a couple of times and had a look and thought, no, I don't like the look of him. And I remember I just kind of gazed longingly across the road to some sort of travel agents, and I saw that there were bus trips to Prague. I thought, that's what I'll do. I'll go to Prague. I catch them, and then I went, "What do you mean you go to Prague? You haven't got any money. You can't go anywhere. You are stuck." And not only that, but as each day passes, we're getting closer and closer to Christmas. And as any fool knows, nobody takes on new tenants before Christmas. Come to that, no agents take on new clients before Christmas. Really, nothing's going to happen. Feeling the sting of injustice as I got back on the train to go back to Gooseberry Station. That this whole world is always like, you need to get a job, you need to get going, you need to get doing things. Oh, and by the way, we're all going to stop for 3 weeks over Christmas. Good luck, mate. Oh, the next day I went into the middle of town to sell some of my belongings. I mean, I only had books and CDs. And most of my books, actually, I ditched one way or the other before I left Toronto. Any that I thought might have any value at all, I tried to sell. And any that I'd read, I gave away. The only ones I was left with was sort of this really curious collection of books that I had been unable to resist buying and then unable to read. So, I mean, they were really like the Hermetica and the Nag Hammadi Bible. I mean, like, who sits down for an evening and reads the Book of Enoch? Nobody. But I couldn't quite throw it away. So I started reading Herbert Butterfield's The Origins of Modern Science. I was quite enjoying it, actually. So, and while I was in the middle of town, having sold a few things and gained a bit of money, I also followed up on a lead that Janet had given me about an address on Piccadilly that offered emergency accommodation. I thought, I am moving towards emergency accommodation. And I got there and I found it was just a little office. And you went in and you registered your name, and then you had to wait outside in the street for a few hours. And so finally they assigned everybody to some church basement for the night in some town off in Essex, Ilford or somewhere like that. I realized this actually was a service for the properly down and out, and I wasn't there yet. I still had my place in Chiswick. I had been there. I had been with the Down and Out one time when I was about 21 at the end of 1975. I'd stayed in what they called then a spike in Shepherd's Bush. I do remember going and signing my name, and then they let you in, and there was some beds. There was a dormitory. If I didn't fancy sleeping in the bed, so I just sat in the lounge with about 4 or 5 other guys who looked and sounded and were named as if they were from some State of the Nation play in the early 1950s. Like, there was a bloke from Liverpool who was called Scouse. There was a bloke from Glasgow who was called Jock. It was all kind of on the nose as that, but they were great. They were really friendly. And they told me that about 5 o'clock in the morning, they would set off from there. They would take the tube for nothing. I joined in with them, and they showed me how to take the tube without paying a fare. And we'd go into the West End, where they would sign up with these big swank West End hotels for a day's casual labor washing up. And they did the same thing. You signed there, and then you had to wait out in the street for hours. And those of us who could afford it went and sat in the cheapest cafe in the West End. We just sat there with that kind of pale, frothy coffee that they used to specialize in England. I remember Scouse told me he was a chef, like a registered chef, but every now and then he just went, I got to leave the sensible world of bills and wages, and I just want to go back wandering. And Jock had some similar story. There was some kerfuffle outside. It was like nearly a fight. And there was one of the guys I was sat at a table with, skinny wee guy. He just kind of rolled his eyes and he said, it's amazing what decent people will get up to, isn't it? I thought that's such a brilliantly pitched piece of irony that in a strange kind of way made me think, I better leave. If I don't leave now, I'm just going to be having too good a time and find it difficult. I'm going to be like Scouse, every now and then going, I want to go back see my mates in Shepherd's Bush. So I did. I left. I hitchhiked out of town. I had no money left. But I was fortunate enough that I hitchhiked all the way back from London. I got dropped at the end of my road, and I had 1 penny in my pocket. Anyway, I didn't sign up in the office. I didn't want to go and sleep in a church basement in East London. The next day, I met up with Janet on Portobello Road. And, when I got there, I wondered, how come I've never looked up and down the newsagents in the Portobello Road? I've never considered trying to move in here, but it was because it was too groovy, it was too interesting. And people were too well dressed. And I wasn't sufficient. Anyway, we were meeting an old friend of Janet's. I'd never met him before. I think his name was John. He was very quiet, shy, reserved, thoughtful kind of guy, skinny. Liked him, a bit undernourished, a bit over-thoughtful, always a bit bent. And he invited us over to his place for a cup of tea. But first, he said you had to go and buy this very special apricot jam, originally made in Portugal, that they only sold at one deli in the area that had an enormous lineup outside of it. So Janet and I and Jim sat in a coffee shop for about an hour waiting for him to queue up. Finally, he turned up with the precious jam and took us to his place. As soon as we got in, he said, look, he said, I had a bit of a tidy up before you got here, but nobody is allowed to look in the kitchen. And he opened the door, and all over the floor of this place was like this foaming sea of stuff, magazines, books, videos, rolled up posters. There was a poster for a movie he'd been in, a gangster movie. He'd just made a movie that nobody had seen, and that was one thing that we had in common. I had too. And I kind of gingerly made my way across the floor without stepping on any of the breakable stuff and sat down on the sofa, and I was scanning it, and I saw that in amidst the churning waves of cultural excretion, there were some books about feng shui. And I mentioned this, he went, yeah, he said, I've really been getting into it. I mean, it might be rubbish, but if you think about it, it's been around for a long time, so there probably must be something to it. London has been laid out all wrong, completely wrong, I tell you. They've just made a mess of it. And the two of us stood there, staring out the window at this erroneous city. He said, that sofa there is my love and romance sofa. And this chair, this armchair, is where I sit to think of money and success. And he sat down on this chair with his hands on the arms of the chair, staring straight ahead to demonstrate how he meditates upon money and success while sat in this chair. And it turned out that with the aid of the ancient wisdom of Feng Shui, his latest idea for earning money had been to go on a night class in stand-up comedy. And I hope he did very well. I don't think I've ever heard of him, but maybe he's eaten more. Anyway, Janet and Jem and I caught the bus back to her home neighborhood of Harleston. About 3 stops before we got there, she said, I've got to go to the bank. Can I just leave him with you? And she got off before I could really answer. And he started following her, and I hooked my forefinger into the hood of his duffel coat and pulled him back. We had a few stops. The traffic was very slow. I had plenty of time to plot how I was going to get him off the bus. I had some bags with me, so I just kind of scooped my arm around him, but that just tipped him up, and he landed poof, on his back and lay there. To his credit, with just a look of vague disappointment in his face, like, that's not the best game you've thought of, kind of thing. So I put the bags down, picked him up, and then picked up the bags. And I walked along the aisle of this bus like somebody carrying a bomb, talking all the way. Excuse me, please, let me through, let me through. Small child in transit, and down the stairs and out. And walking the streets. We're in Harleston. We're walking along. And he keeps pointing at things. Mummy, he says. I said, no, Jim, that's a garage. Okay. He goes, Mummy. I said, no, Jim, that's a bollard. Mummy, no, Jim, that's a block of flats. And we got to the corner of his road, and I saw there was a very, very old man was walking along this garden path. From the front door was behind him, and ahead of him was this gate that he was staring towards and slowly making for. And in the doorway was an old guy who was much younger, like maybe this guy's son, who was old himself, but not old like this guy. He was just standing in the doorway watching. And by the gate there were these 3 ancient women. And they were laughing. And one of them says, you think he'll be all right spending the evening with those girls, eh? And they all laughed. And the guy in the doorway didn't crack a smile. Don't expect him back before morning, will you? Only we'll be having so much fun. And they all laughed. To my surprise, I was enraged by this. I just was furious at them. I thought, how can they be having such a good time? And it's so cold, so dark, and so late in the day. Anyway, we got in. When Janet returned, she gave some food to Jim and went upstairs to get some things sorted out. So Jim and I sat at the kitchen table. Mashed potatoes and peas. But he seemed much more interested in the aerodynamic properties of mashed potato than the nutritional ones, because he just kept flicking bits of it about the place. I didn't feel important enough to get angry. So I just kind of contented myself with staring at him dully going, that's not really super entertaining, Jim. That's not really all that clever, Jim. Finally, it landed right in my eye. I thought, actually, no, I don't have to put up with that. So the thing out of my eye socket, but mashed potato, put it on his plate, took his plate, tipped all the food into the bin and washed the plate. And I thought, he's just going to erupt. But when I turned around, he hadn't. He'd walked right up to me. He was standing there looking up at me, looking kind of worried, with his arms outstretched as if for a hug. I came out of Barons Court Station. I turned right and then left. And I found myself walking past this row of enormous townhouses whose weirdly ornate frontages had been charred black by the fumes of 6 rows of passing traffic. It was cold, it was dark, it was windy. I was walking quickly with my head down as if in a hurry. From the corner of my eye, it seemed to me that some of these houses were empty. And the one I was looking for was one of the seedier ones. There was an enormous Christmas tree in the window. I realized it couldn't be the right place. The right place was obviously right. There was a grand porch and, as I'd been told, a plaque by the window saying Study Society. As I approached, the door was open to admit an older couple, whom I judged from the cut of their clothing to be well off and foreign. I entered in their slipstream and I found myself in a brightly lit, warm hallway. With the carpet was very thick, and I could see straight away that all the furnishings were older than I and looked set to outlive me. It was all very solid. And I was gently interrupted by this guy who was, I'd say he was about 60. He was wearing a bow tie and a blazer and an ingratiating sort of manner. He had very pale skin and an enormous dent in his forehead. He asked if I'd been here before. I said I hadn't. Well, would you mind awfully writing your name on that list there? We need to keep a record of numbers. Welcome. Welcome. And I couldn't even explain to myself why I felt offended by this question, or why, when I saw that my name was already on the list, I felt vindicated. And I just stood there, ignored really, while the man with the bow tie counseled the older couple, who turned out to be Dutch, not to be alarmed by anything they might see that evening. I just wandered up the big, grand central staircase that was adorned on every step by a little candle that was set in the smallest commercially available size of plastic flower pot. And at the top of the stairs to the left was a hall, a large room, a hall. And at the near end, there was about 50 seats laid out in rows. I joined a crowd of around 30. We were just waiting. We were all quiet, except for one woman who couldn't stop coughing. I had some lozenges, so I gave her one. At the far end of the hall, there was like a 5-foot plinth. And on top of that, there appeared to be some kind of statuette, some sort of graven image, but I couldn't make out what it was because it was wrapped in black cloth. Because I had no idea what to expect, I couldn't say whether we were there for long. Two doors opened about halfway along the wall, and a man entered. He was wearing a black cloak, a fluorescent crimson fur stole, and a fez that was so tall it almost seemed comical, like a double-decker fez. He knelt in an attitude of prayer in front of a picture that lay on the floor. And by and by, about 20 more people, men and women, probably aged between their 20s and their 60s, also dressed in black cloaks, wearing the same outsized fezzes, entered in slow procession and gathered in a loose semicircle around the mysterious statuette at the far end. The first man to come in took off his crimson stole and began to speak. I didn't know the language, but it sounded like scripture. And then some music started. I could hear the hiss of tape, but also the click of vinyl. And there was a band, played something that sounded like it came from a place where East meets West. And then there was a flute solo, and then it stopped. At some command from the speaker, the 20 people around the mysterious statuette undid their cloaks and let them fall to the floor, revealing long, white, flowing robes. One by one, they came up to the speaker, who may or may not have given them some small individual signal, and then gathered in the center of the hall, where they folded their arms carefully across their chests. The music started up again. One of them spread his arms out with the palm of his right hand facing upwards and the palm of his left facing down and started spinning. His white robes fanned out in an elegant skirt. And then another started spinning with exactly the same attitude. Then another, then another, then another, till all of them. I spotted the friend who'd invited me. I thought her expression looked at times ecstatic and at other times very worried. And I thought, probably this movement, this turning, sometimes seems like the easiest thing in the world, and then at other times looks nearly impossible. Anyway, there were no catastrophes except for the occasional tilting face that was subtly adjusted. The music stopped, and all the turners stood around in little groups, silently gathering their breath, and then the music started again. They did the same thing again. There were 5 bouts of turning and 4 breaks. And when it was over, time returned. They went to the far end and rummaged through the cloaks on the ground with excruciating slowness, trying to each of them find the one with their name tag in, put them all on very slowly, and then shuffled out of the room one by one, pausing in the doorway to give a little bow. And I heard a voice invite us all into the next room for a buffet. And I suddenly found myself standing next to the man with the enormous dent in his forehead. He asked me if I'd found what I'd seen interesting. I admitted I had. And then he inquired whether I'd felt welcome at the ceremony. And this I found more difficult to answer. But I managed to say, yes, I did. Yeah, he said, oh, good. He said that. Because it's important to these ceremonies that everyone is welcome. Absolutely everyone. I couldn't help wondering why, beneath that absolutely everyone, I heard even you. Not sure whether I was annoyed with myself or annoyed with him. I wouldn't leave until I got him to tell me a little bit about himself. He said he'd come to this place first for one of these ceremonies in 1966. But in 1982, he'd had a big car crash that had necessitated considerable brain surgery, and he hadn't been able to turn since that time. He still came. He still had friends from his first visit. That was enough. I went into the next room and I got talking with my friend, and she explained to me that the whole thing was a 13th century dervish ceremony. It's still practiced in some villages in rural Turkey, and that in those places, it's understood generally that the black cloaks represent the turners' graves, the fezzes are the gravestones, and the white robes are their grave clothes, and that in fact, in the villages where it's still performed, the turners will be buried in those white cloths. And she herself wanted to be buried in her robe. I said, what was the mysterious statuette at the far end of the hall? Oh, she said, that's a plaster parrot that someone found in the basement. And they wrapped it in a black cloak to try and make the turners laugh. Her boyfriend, who was there with an enormous plate of fruit, smiled at me and he said, I believe you actors call it corpsing. It was getting towards Christmas. My plan was to go up to North Wales to see my parents. And I thought before I do that, knowing that I was going to have to leave the rented, furnished room that I had just a few days after I got back, I decided to tidy the place up. I did a real severe, serious job of it too. I was quite pleased with what I'd done. I emptied everything, cleaned everything. It was all, and at the end, I flung the window open to let some fresh air in. And sadly, I found I couldn't close it after that. It just could not. It was jammed, completely jammed. But it didn't matter because that evening of the 22nd of December was unusually mild evening for the time of year. So I slept fine and off I went up to Wales the next day. Kind of difficult to be there in a way because it seemed so close to the end of being able to call myself a professional actor that I really didn't want to go, you know, you were right all those years ago. All those times when you raised your voice and said, this will never work, you were absolutely right. Thanks for the advice. And I'm sorry I didn't think at the time. So I just didn't discuss the situation at all. I went for long walks along the seafront and read Mr. Butterfield's Origins of Modern Science, finding it more and more interested. I felt somehow soothed by the thought that a few hundred years ago, the wisest and the most decorated minds in the world believed that all the heavens were 9 concentric circles that all turned together without friction. It's nice of me to think that, you know, people can be so completely majestically, grandiloquently wrong and still have a career in the world. Anyway, I came back down to London just after Christmas and I was glad that was done. By then, Janet had said, you know, if you don't have anywhere, then you can stay at my place. I really didn't want to because being the guy in the spare room is often, in some mysterious way, that's hard to understand the way of falling out. So Janet knew that as well. She wasn't crazy about that idea. But anyway, I got in there and got to my own room and there you go, it was done. And nearly the end of the year and London had cleaned up and I went to bed and I was going to remember that I couldn't close the window because the cold had descended and it was too cold to sleep. I was there, I had this duvet, I wrapped the duvet around me, I fished out some other blankets, and it's still too cold. I had to start putting clothes on. Finally, I was like fully dressed, it was still too cold. I had to put my shoes on, boots on, still too cold. I had to wear a bubble hat and a scarf and an overcoat, and then take the overcoat off and wear both my jackets and put the overcoat over it and and it still didn't work. It was still too cold. I tried putting the electric fire on. The thing with the electric fire is if you're this close, it scorches you. If you're that close, it's as if it doesn't exist. So I thought, well, even if I leave it on, and it can try to heat the whole of Gunnersbury, then it's not going to heat me unless I turn over and the bedclothes next to it, and then they'll set fire to it. It was impossible the whole night. I was haggard and exhausted by the time the night finished. And that afternoon, I went up to see Janet. And it's great to see her again. And a bunch of them had been out. Janet had been seeing some friends, and she'd come back. And Jim and his friend, who was about the same age, had both been given as Christmas presents these kind of inflatable tomahawks. They were about as big as they were. They were swinging these things around. I mean, like if they'd actually had any kind of lethal effect, then it would be like, you know, the Great Harlesden Tomahawk Massacre. But they just kind of were berate. And people got talking to me, and I explained that I'd been signing on and trying to get some money, and that 5 weeks after I'd first signed on, I still hadn't had any warning that any money was coming. And of course, a friend of Janet's explained how she had a cousin who worked for the DSS in Bristol, and she knew, therefore, that they had a conscious policy of slowing down planes. But I didn't want to be getting into that. I didn't want to be saying it's Kafkaesque and I'm unlucky. The little nippers went out into the garden, and I followed them. It was easier being with just small people who weren't going to try and be helpful. And the two of them, Jim and his friend, whatever his name was, devised this game very quickly. What they would do is they would hang their inflated tomahawks on this washing line and then climb on plastic outdoor chairs and knock them off the washing line and then get off the plastic chairs shouting, "I'll do it," and then replace the tomahawks onto the washing line. And you can see they were both trying to do it. And both of them were just subtly getting it wrong. Jim would stand on his chair, he would hang the tomahawk on the washing line, and then he would hit the tomahawk along the side of the barrel so they would just swing back and forth. I said, Jim, all you have to do, hit the underneath, just bang with the same kind of force, and the tomahawk will come up. He did that once. The other line, he couldn't get the tomahawk on because he was holding it halfway along the barrel. So the tomahawk wouldn't quite reach up to the washing line. So I just told him, just hold it nearer the bottom of the barrel and you'll be able to. And he did, climbed up, bang. And so they just did that. Oh, I mean, like God knows how many times, just like bang, I'll do it, 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 bang. And it was boring and enchantingly boring at the same time. And then suddenly they just stopped and ran back indoors. And I was like, oh. I decided to leave. I was enjoying everyone's company, but I just didn't trust my face somehow. I just didn't want to be around people who could have some kind of chance of reading what was going on in my mind. And also I felt like there was some unusual infection was brewing in my leg. Leg was sore. And somewhere it came to me that the best way of treating this leg infection was to walk, was to go for a long walk. So I excused myself. Janet gave me some keys to get in, and I still didn't have anywhere in the next few days, which how could I? And she said, I'll see you in a few days. And I set off walking from Janet's place. And this was the least picturesque walk I think I've ever taken, from Harlesden down to Gunnersbury. You go through a place called Park Royal, which is the big hospital and an industrial estate. These wavy roads that used to be the edge of farmlands a couple of 100 years ago, but now it's all just concrete as far as the eye can see, featureless. I got to Hanger Lane, the beauty, the majesty of Hanger Lane, which is just these enormous concrete underpasses and flyovers. And I noticed that around these places, there'd been some recent campaign of graffiti. Somebody had written, spray painted on the walls, Johnny Big Pants, all over the place. It was like, and I thought, like, how does that work? Like, does this guy who lives in the area, does he sit in his kitchen one night going, I need a name, I need a name, I need a name. Captain Sexuality, no, that's too kind of Sunday supplements. No, Lizard King, nah, too spooky. No, Johnny Big Pants, that's it. That's my name. That's what I'm going to call myself. And then off he goes. Like, what does he hope to achieve? Like, is he hoping that one day he'll be in a shop and they hear a couple of women going, I hear Johnny Big Pants is in the area. Has anyone actually seen him? And he'll be able to have this superhero smile, you know, kind of secret smile going, little do they know. Like, how? And then as I'm thinking that, I suddenly think, but you know what? Even in this satirical fantasy, Johnny Big Pants has got a kitchen. He's doing better than me. Just went smack right in my face. And I thought, you know, I can't believe this is happening. It's only 10 weeks ago. I was in Vancouver, sitting at the front of the cinema there, waiting for the question and answer on my movie, you know? And here I am. I'm like walking, I'm like nothing. And I could see that I hadn't been really a victim of anything. I mean, it wasn't, for example, in all that time as if I'd spent any time at all looking for another job. I mean, yeah, acting work, yeah, but I just, security guard, stacking shelves, no, none of that. So it wasn't that I was unlucky so much as I just happened to be the wrong kind of person. And I got home 6-7 miles later, home chilled, and just as I was walking down the street, there was a guy kneeling, and he'd taken one of the paving stones off the pavement. And he had a box with a red flashing light on the top of it and some kind of metal rod that was going down below the pavement. Find out, mate, he says as I came up, walking, watch out. I said, oh, what are you doing? He said, that's for me to know and you to never find out. Just like, what is that? Is that friendly? Is that where I am? Am I in a friendly place? Or, round and round and round and round my head, that question went like all night. And once again, it was a cold night. So once again, even though I was in 2 jackets and an overcoat and a bobble hat and with this scarf wrapped up around my neck and my shoes, I still couldn't sleep. I started reading the Butterfield book, and that at 5 o'clock, I thought the local cafe might be open. So I took the book down there and I'm reading it with shivering hands, just more and more interested, just escaping into Captain Induction, Bacon, and his overturning of all the people who had had the grand visions of how the universe worked, and the voices in the cave, and on and on and on. And I realized suddenly that what he was describing was that every branch of science kind of got clogged up for hundreds of years, really, in its kind of worship of Aristotle. And that all of them moved forward to their current, much more potent states when they decided to consciously put aside the notion that the way the mind perceives things has any kind of particular validity. I mean, that sounds like a grand way of putting it. What I mean is, we see the sun rise. They did a lot better when they went, the sun doesn't rise. That's what we see, but that's only an optical illusion from the turning of the planets. And if a tree falls in the forest, we hear it, but if there's nobody there to hear it, it's just some vibrations in the air, or what makes it sound is the human ear to receive it. And all of these things, space, time, light, sound, objects, all of them actually are just products of the way the human mind perceives and orders the world, and are not the kind of ultimate reality. So it was in witnessing all of these things that all the main sciences moved forward. This is all I'm seeing in the little cafe, So I'm thinking, okay, so if all the main sciences, physics and astronomy and all that, all move forward by completely ignoring the products of the human mind, then when scientists say that they are close to proving that the human mind does not really exist, that in fact, all we are is a set of illusions deluding ourselves that we exist, are they actually getting close to that truth, or are they just remarking upon a side effect of their methods of investigation? It doesn't matter whether it made sense. It made sense to me at that moment. It felt like one of the only times in my life when my mind had synthesized a whole bunch of data and just gone, so therefore I see this. There's a couple of other times when I was a teenager it happened. My science teacher had once stepped back and said, "You're a genius, man." I thought, that's what he'd say now. He saw me now. And all I have to do now is prove it. And I kind of looked up and I saw there I am, the little cafe, just before dawn, with the steam on the windows and the tables bolted to the floor. And I thought, Alan, how do you intend to convince the scientific establishment of anything? You could try with the person at the next table, but they would probably tell you how the whole animal kingdom are just the products of zoological experiments by Atlantean scientists. It's beaten. I was amazed at how beaten I was. And my phone rang. Later that morning, as I was walking around just to try to keep warm, I was walking around. I felt warmer outdoors than I did at home. And it was Dave's wife, Branna. And I hadn't heard from her in a while, but I said, "How are you?" And she said, "I'm great," she said. "I've actually finally got a visa to go and join Dave over in New York. And I'm going to set off on the 1st of January. So I just wondered whether you'd like to stay in our flat for the month of January, because we'll be away for a month." I went, yeah, I think I would. Yeah, that would be great. So I walked around a little bit more. It was New Year's Eve. It was the 3rd day after my 3 sleepless nights. I was preposterously haggard. The landlord came around with a handing over of the keys and the ceremonial moving out thing. he he started shouting at me about a bunch of things that he said I'd destroyed in the flat. He apologized grumpily for the window jamming, and he gave me half my deposit back, and I hadn't expected to see any of the deposit at all. So I just said, "Bye, thanks." I was sorry he'd shouted because I'd liked him the day we met, and off he stumped. And I went for another walk. Just sat in Richmond Green. So chilly, so cold. And I hadn't slept for 3 nights. And just like Jim, when Jim got really tired, it was like the wrong seats, the wrong room, the wrong company, the wrong planner. That was how I felt, and I burst into tears. And then that was over. So I went round New Year's Eve, went round to Branna's to pick up the keys, Branna's and Dave's. And she was throwing a party for her friends who had all come over in the last few years from Sarajevo. But I mean, fled real trouble, like real trouble, not out of work actor trouble. And it was great. It was lovely. There were lovely people. They had that spirit of people who traveled a long way. It's always enchanting. And they couldn't really speak English, so it was great. I didn't have the chance to explain my troubles to anyone. And then at New Year's Eve, we sang Auld Lang Syne. And they went, "What is that? What is that song?" I said, "I don't know." "What does it mean?" "I don't know, but it's English." "It's not English, it's Scots." And I thought, that's the game. You find some good company, you sing a song that no one can understand, and you begin again. Thank you.